Hello there, and welcome to the quick start video for Rocket Lasso's newest plugin, Mesh To Spline. In this video, we're going to be going over a series of projects and scene files as a way of looking at the different parameters, the most useful ones, and just breaking them down, seeing how you might be able to use this in your own workflow. To start out with, I've got this nice car model. This is from the asset browser, and I've got a series of different Mesh To Splines, each one doing a slightly different thing, to create this final, almost Sketch Toon look, but we're seeing it directly here in the viewport. This would render great with Sketch Toon, or especially with third-party renderers. And then, if I were to select this linear field, I can drop my minimum, and everything will disappear. So I can show you, I can drag this through the car, and it's going to slowly reveal all these different parts. So the plan is, let's break this down and try and recreate the look here, pretty much from scratch. So in this case, I will delete out all of the Mesh To Splines, and we're left with just the raw geometry here from the car. If you're interested in doing this exact same setup, what I did was track down a car from the asset browser by searching the word car. There's several of them. I used the car hot hatch, and when you load that in, I deleted out the car rig, and then creating a series of connect objects, I set the connect object to don't weld, renamed it, and then fed all the parts of the body into this connect object, all of the interior parts into this interior connect object, etc., just to keep it nice and clean for this demo. So with all of those created, I would like to hide all of them. So visually, I'll turn those all off. We could even say don't render. And then under extensions or plugin, you will find your Mesh To Spline. Creating that, I can drag it down here to the bottom, and what do I want to do? Well, let's work on the body of the car first. Dragging the body of the car directly as a child of the Mesh To Spline, that will actually consume the entire model and return a spline instead. A preferred workflow that I have, though, is don't make it a child, and instead, you can set source geometry to objects and then drag in any model you want, including, a whole bunch of different models, drag them in. And that is now remote linking into that, and it just makes it so that it doesn't need multiple copies of the body of the car, and you'll see that as we move forward. There's a couple of nice settings inside here where I could hide the model if I wanted to. It's already hidden, but let's say I didn't hide that. I could click this eyeball button, and that will now hide the stoplights here in the object manager. And also we could say, hey, I don't actually want to be calculating this or not, so you can turn that on or off. With that selected, I can now spin around, and what is happening is every bit of the mesh that was inside of the body there is now been converted to a spline. This is something we could render Sketch Toon on, we could render hair, we can use third-party renderers and create them. We could sweep this. It is creating a new spline instead of the mesh. There's a lot of things we can do from here though. Inside of Mesh To Spline, I will collapse the source geometry so we can look around. There are three main settings: edge mode, polygon mode, and outline mode. So these are the edges, or you could set that to polygon mode, which isn't visually going to look too different, but you'll see the changes in a moment. And then outline, which will outline anything that is currently selected as an object. Moving back to edge mode, let's take a look at a couple of different settings. First of all, we've got threshold. What threshold is going to do is it behaves a lot like the awesome bevel deformer. And the bevel deformer has this angle threshold, and only things that are sharper than this threshold will get beveled. In that same way, in Mesh To Spline, only edges that are sharper, based on their two neighboring polygons, only sharper than that angle will get shown. So by increasing this threshold, we will see that we are seeing fewer and fewer and fewer edges. So in this particular setup, this might be a cool way of getting some highlights on the car, these sharper angles. So how about renaming this one to highlights? Keeping this nice and clean and organized, I would like to colorize it. So under basic, I'll say display color on, and let's go with a green color. So if these are the highlights, I'll make it a very light green. So there are some highlights. Next up, let's do it from scratch. I'll make a new Mesh To Spline, and this time I would like it to be fed in that car body again. So I'll drag in, twirl that down, drag in the car's body, collapse it back down again, and I would like it to be an outline. So this is now outlining all of those different parts of the model. I would like to push those edges outward a bit. So we have an offset for that. If I start increasing this offset, you can see this will inflate outward, or we can even go downward and push it in. I'll just go out by 1, just enough for it to poke outside of where the highlights are. And that's actually just working out of the gate really nicely. So under basic, I will again colorize it. And this time we'll go very, very dark green to show the outlines. Now you can see I've got this dark, almost black line outlining everything. Next up, we'll make another brand new one. Mesh to Spline, drag this down. And this time I would like it to, well, again, be fed an object. The object shall be the body. And this time I'll go into polygon mode. And now every single polygon is showing up. We have the same setting like offset. I can push offset and you'll see the entire thing gets pushed outward. We can also go negative on that. But there's additional settings with that. If we offset this a whole bunch, we can turn on fields and it will open up an offset field tab. And now we're able to feed through any of the fields inside of Cinema 4D. In this case, keep it simple with a linear field, which I will spin to Z+. And that can now be dragged through the model of the car to move these individual pieces to go back to 0 or out to the full offset length. In this case, we don't actually want to do this, but I thought that was really cool. Anytime you can unlock the power of fields is a good thing. So turning that off, let's also get rid of offset. We also have a grow option. In polygon mode, grow will shrink the individual polygons all the way down to 0 if we want, or we could even increase it and push them beyond and make them look all kind of crazy, exploding out the model. Different things will have different use cases. In the case of this car, we want to keep things clean. So putting that back to the default of 100%, I am now seeing every single polygon get outlined. Again, we could increase the threshold and see less of them, but in this case, I do want to see every single polygon. So how about pushing this down 2 units of offset and say I want to go to basic and under display color turn on, and this will be kind of the underlayer under the highlight. So it'll be green, but it'll be a bit darker. So deselecting that, you can now see we get the overall car getting revealed pretty well, but there are so many more options on top of this. Going back into that same Mesh to Spline, which we should name these. Let's rename this outline, and this new one, name that one polygon. Something I forgot to mention is the icons will actually change depending on what mode you're in. That way you can very quickly see which one you want to select without even knowing what the name is. Deleting that linear field, we don't need it. We just see our nice overall car. I'd kind of like this color to be a little bit nicer. Let's go to a little bit more of a lime olive green. Okay, so moving back into this polygon one, inside, let's take a look at our facing angle. What facing angle is going to do is behave a lot like the Fresnel as a texture. A Fresnel usually has the color white facing directly towards the camera and then black as it fades around to the sides. So we're using that same concept. Depending on the angle of a polygon or an edge and the way it is facing the current camera, it will display it or not. Switching facing angle to view, all of the polygons that are facing away from us have now disappeared. So you see none of the polygons on that door are there. But as I spin the camera around, you will see they do get revealed as soon as we're viewing it from that angle. So this unlocks some pretty cool possibilities. There are a couple of different angle settings. We have our minimum and our maximum. These individual sliders can be changed, so we can pull away from that front-facing one, or we can increase this to travel around the back. There's also some preset buttons, so we can say I want to see all, or just the front, just the back, just an outline, which is going to, let me turn off the other two. This is just going to show the things that are perfectly on that edge. We could increase that range a bit to see a little bit more, and we kind of get some shading where any of those sides are meeting the camera, and those will actually change and update as I rotate the camera. So depending on the style you're going for, that can be a pretty cool addition. And then, oh, actually what I want to do is, let's say that we really like the look of that. We can also lock it to this current view. If I say lock view, it will switch to camera mode and create a camera. And now it's not linked to our current camera, but it's now linked to this newly created Mesh to Spline camera. So where that camera is looking, that is how those are being generated. Even if we change these settings, it's based on that camera. And you could take this camera and move it around, and depending on where it's looking, it's going to draw different shapes, and you could create more than one of those to create different angles. So we don't actually need that camera. I will spin around and zoom up. What might be useful in the setup we're doing here would be, let's say I only want to see these from the front, and then I'll make a duplicate of that. And this one, I only want to see the ones on the back. Those backside ones I want to color darker. So under basic, I'll say make that darker. And let's call this one front and call this one polygon back. Deselecting everything, we can now see we have darker polygons selected on that backside and lighter ones in the front. Turning on the highlights again, turning on our outline, we can now see that we have been layering up a bunch of different mesh to splines, and they are super clean, super stable, running nice and quick. Once again, ready to be fed into a sweep or fed into your favorite third-party renderer to render them out directly. We could create additional looks very, very simply here. I'm not going to make all of them, but let's do a little bit of the interior. So a brand new Mesh to Spline. In this case, I will rename it Interior and feed it a remote source geometry of the interior. And now everything's going to show up. You see it's actually taking up a lot of visual space there. So column it down a bunch with this threshold, pull way back on it. And actually, let's go in between there. And this interior, I don't want to call too much attention, so we'll go with maybe a dark tan. So we'll pull that way back. And maybe we want a couple highlights on that interior. So a duplicate of the interior. This time I'll push out with a single offset. And we want even fewer of these. So only the ones that are the sharpest of angles will show up. And that one, I'll say that can be a lighter color to make it pop out a little bit more. There we go. So some highlights on that. Once again, these are completely stable. As I rotate the camera around, they're not popping in and out of existence. They're just staying there. So if you use Sketch Toon, oftentimes things just kind of pop in and out, but these are just always there. Of course, if you turn on front angle, facing angle, then they will pop in and pop out, but that would be something that you are deciding very specifically that you want to do. So there we go. If we turn on all those different layers we created, we now have a car interior. We now have some of this exterior. We could select a copy of this outline. Instead of the body, I'd like to feed in the glass, and now I'm outlining the glass, set basic to something very bright. And now we have the windshields highlighted, and all of these are ready to send out and render. The renders are really quick when you're using just raw splines in a third-party renderer or even Sketch Toon. Sketch Toon likes just splines. Instead of analyzing an entire object, it can just apply directly to the spline and render it out. So that will wrap this demo up. For our next file, we've got the T-Rex, also from the asset browser, created by Sebastian Florend. I've liked this for a really long time. It's just got great geometry, and it's got a great stomping animation here. Absolutely love it. I baked it out to Alembic and deleted out the rig, just so it's running as quick as possible for us. I also prepared a couple of sweeps that we'll deal with in a moment, and a couple of selection tags on the body. So if you go to edge mode, you can select anything as an edge on the T-Rex, but I've already prepared a few. So double clicking on this one, it's called jewelry. So let's give the T-Rex a couple of bracelets. There are some loop selections on his ankles and on his wrists. So let's create a brand new extensions, Mesh to Spline. And with this Mesh to Spline, what do I want to feed it? Well, I want it to be in objects mode. The objects will be the body of the T-Rex. And, you know, now we see the edges. We can change this to whatever we want. We could change the threshold down to lower. I could hide the body of the T-Rex, and we can do just the offset and inflate the T-Rex or deflate it. Change that to polygon mode, shrink the individual polygons, explode them outward. We got a lot of options, a lot of crazy things we could do. But in this case, I'd like to stay in edge mode and limit it to a selection. So under restrict, I'll say I want a selection. And then a selection tab opens up. Selecting that, I can drag in a edge tag. So grabbing that jewelry edge tag, we will now see, instead of seeing every single spline, we're only seeing splines where those edges had been. So let's bring back the T-Rex, and we can now see that we've got some nice splines around the wrists and the ankles. But let's go and add a little bit more. Let's give him a necklace as well. So selecting the body of the T-Rex, hitting UL, I would like a loop right there on the neck. And something cool you can do in S24 is they changed the selection tags. So I can just make a duplicate of one of these and say update, and it's based on the current selection. So that updated, rename this one to neck. And now there's a neck selection, really easy to make there. And it's a lot better than going into the menu and finding the drop down for a tag every single time. So with that created, I can go into the Mesh to Spline and add a new selection, and now feed in a second selection tag. So that also has the neck, and that has now been added as well, outputting from the same Mesh to Spline. So that can be fed into this already prepared sweep object with an end side just to kind of create a nice controlled circle. Dropping that as a child, he is now wearing a necklace and some bracelets. The first thing you'll probably notice is they're not closed. That is an open spline. So inside of Mesh To Spline, you can go to the Spline tab and say, okay, spline, you're not open, you're instead closed. And that will close that spline. If we want to round these out a bit, hit NB on the keyboard to see the polygons. In the Spline tab, I can also enable these intermediate points, and those can get smoothed out by changing the spline type to something like a B-spline, changing the intermediate points to something like uniform. Set that to 1, and you see we get a bunch of extra subdivisions there, rounding that out a bit and just giving the T-Rex some nice looking jewelry. Currently, it's intersecting his body a little bit, so we also have the option of inside of the Mesh To Spline, in the main tab, increasing the offset and scooting that away from the body. We can push it way away or just a little bit away, and that's going to be very clean and very stable because it's based on the normals of the mesh. I have a few other crazy selections set up here. Here we have eyebrows for the T-Rex, so if I double click those, you can see there's a selection for the eyebrows. Creating a brand new Mesh To Spline, rename that one Brows. I would like this to be fed the T-Rex model again, and limit to a selection, and feed in the eyebrows. So that has now been returned as a spline, and these eyebrows can be fed into the sweep and end side prepared. And now he's got some big old eyebrows. Then we can go extra crazy. I'll make a duplicate of that one into the mouth, rename it Mouth. And instead of eyebrows, I would like to feed it, what do we got? Yeah, there we go, the lips selection. So in the mouth, I'll drag in lips, and now there's a spline for that. Turning on the mouth one, there is now lips on the T-Rex. That also needs to close the spline. So selecting that, I will say spline closed, and those are now closed. Again, we could round that out if we want to. Very easy to turn that on and set that to B-spline, rounding that out a bit. And what's fun with that one, we can increase that or shrink it, make it look subtle, make it look crazy. And yeah, just fun, goofy things you can do. Lastly, I would like to add a spine on the back of this. Let's change this from a T-Rex to a Spinosaurus, even though a T-Rex is way cooler. On the body, we've got another selection, the very first one, and this is just a line for the spine, just drawn out along his back and his tail there. So let's just do it from scratch, creating a brand new Mesh To Spline. Call that the spine. The model it will be fed is a remote link into the body, restricting it to a selection, the selection being the spine. So there we go. We've got a nice spline just traveling along the back there. Now that's going to be fed into this sweep right here, and that sweep has a helix. So this helix is just a straight line because I took the helix primitive and set the start radius to 0, end radius to 0, and the end angle to 0, and then dropped the point count. So that is now just a straight line. So dragging the spine in to the sweep as the second object, we will see hopefully a bit of geometry get created here. Oh, turn it on. And now you see it's getting created, but it's aiming in some crazy random direction. Like, that's no good. We need it to face a very specific way. Well, we can do that. Mesh to Spline is actually great for this type of thing. If I make a duplicate of the spine, I could say, hey, let's offset that a bit. So I can offset this off the body of the T-Rex, and that is now giving a definitive direction that we want it to travel. So that is now the rail spline. Dragging that in as the third object in a sweep, that now gives it a direction and a scale. I don't want it to give any scale though, so inside of the spine, I can say, yes, you are using the direction of the rail, but do not use the scale of the rail. So if I turn that off, he's now going to get like a crazy mohawk, and that is determined by the length of the helix. So if I hit T for scale, I could scale that up and down, but let's leave it super huge, and inside of the actual sweep, we can rescale it by playing with these handles. So let's put a point in the middle and drag this down. On the tip of the head there, you can see I pull that way down. On the tip of the tail, pull that down, and we can just reshape and sculpt this however we want. Let's give him a big old mohawk in the front, and then maybe pull down near his neck, and then push back out in the middle of his back, and just create any shape that we want here. And it will just make something pretty crazy and wacky, a lot of fun to do. Now, this tool is not out, but it's a little sneak preview of something that we're going to be releasing pretty soon, and it's a helper spline. So under extensions, I've got a secret preview of some helper splines, and here is the upcoming smooth tool. And with the smooth tool, I could take this rail out, and let's push it out even further. So you see kind of what the problem is. As it goes out, you see it starts overlapping itself, and that's why this geometry looks so crazy inside of it, because that mesh is colliding with itself. But if I were to sneak that rail spline into our smooth, that is a way of smoothing out that line. You can see I can increase the smoothing, rounding that out, and that means as that becomes the rail, we'll get a much cleaner mohawk. So not quite out yet, but that's a little sneak preview of something that will be out there not too long from now. Finally, let's feed all of that into this prepared cloth surface, turning that on. It can give that some thickness. Selecting our original spline, we could scoot this away from the body if we want to. We could also scoot it slightly inside the body if we want to make sure that that isn't sticking out at all. But our T-Rex is ready to go out and rumble. The best part being, if I hit play, everything is perfectly stuck onto this model. Any character you've animated, these will automatically stick exactly onto that mesh. In the past, this type of thing would have been really difficult. I'm sure you've tried to do something like create an eyebrow and just have it stick to the character, or even something like this jewelry. Like that would be pretty hard to rig and add on. But here we can just make an edge loop, stick it via a Mesh to Spline, and do anything we want as far as extruding or sweeping or just rendering out directly with a third-party renderer. You can do lots of crazy things, and man, it's just a lot of fun. So let's move on into our next project. For this project, let's see about combining Mesh to Spline with text. Now, text is usually pretty useful to pull out of the Cinema 4D object menu, where you will find text, which is a full three-dimensional text. In older versions of Cinema, that is the MoText inside of the MoGraph menu. So that text I fed into a connect just to make sure that all the points are welded together and all the caps are combined. With that done, we can feed it directly into the Mesh to Spline if we want to. We've already seen a couple of the basic things inside of Mesh to Spline. I could increase the threshold a little bit and start rounding out these really shallow curves. And if I were to continue, let's go really light on that. You can see as I increase it, more and more of those will disappear, as well as the frontal n-gons, or turning on erase n-gons will erase out any predefined n-gon. Playing around further, we have things like the offset that could explode. If we go to polygon mode, those explode really nicely as they all separate out from each other. And a little bit of threshold here goes a long way. I really love the way that these pieces will fly apart. Watch as I do an offset. Those are combined to kind of make a giant curved n-gon as they fly away from the surface. So you can maintain that curvature very, very nicely. I will reset that. Pull out the text, and let's remote link into that instead. So source geometry, objects, the object will be my text. I would like to hide the original text, and now we've got just the Mesh to Spline. Something that is fun is feeding that into a cloner. So creating a brand new cloner, setting that to linear, and making two different Mesh to Splines. The cloner can be set to blend mode. And blend, of course, will blend between the properties of any parameter as long as it's something that can be blended. So with two identical Mesh to Splines, we don't see any difference. But if we start changing one of them, let's say we offset one, you can now see that we have 3 layers. Let's also, in the growth, we'll shrink that down, way down, to be kind of pointed. So now I could feed in the cloner. Let's add a couple extra clones for the transition. And you can see we get these super duper crazy shapes really, really quickly. And those can modify however we like, as long as it's something that can blend, those can be modified. Grab both of them and turn off the n-gons, and we will see, oh, and let's get rid of the threshold as well. And now each individual one is breaking apart. We'll see that even better if we grab that original text and set the subdivisions to something like subdivided. So now it's subdividing a lot more often. Let's say that it's got a pretty sharp angle, but every 15 it'll make a break. So just for clarity, this is what it looks like. So now it's blending between them, and we can create an entire series through the cloner. Once you have created a series of them, you can colorize these very easily through grabbing the cloner and feeding it. Let's do a plane effector. The plane effector will be told to output, actually let's go into fall off, and I would like to feed in a step field. So the step field can turn on color, and the instant that we do, you see colors appear on the splines. Inside of color remap, we can say color mode is not a color, but instead is a gradient. And now we have 100% control over the way it transitions from one mesh to spline to the outer mesh to spline. Click load preset in the gradient, and we can load any of these cinema presets. How about flame 2? And we get this nice purple flame, colorizing that as it goes. Right click, invert. Let's see, actually, yeah, invert gradient. It'll flip to the opposite direction. And feed in any gradient you like in there. Being able to transition between these states is an effect I do really often. Resimplifying the scene, I will yank out just one of their mesh to splines and delete everything else. So now we just get the original mesh to spline again. What I would like to do now is begin combining this with Voronoi fracture. And Voronoi fractures in Cinema 4D are very, very fun to play around with, and they unlock a lot of potential. So with this being the raw text, I would like to feed that into the MoGraph Voronoi fracture. So with that fed in, it's going to break apart the individual chunks, meaning I could do all sorts of things, including push those away from each other. Here's some offset fragments to break them apart. And this can be fed directly into our mesh to spline. So mesh to spline, turn it on. I do not want to link into this text, but I do want to link into the Voronoi fracture. Visually hide that, and this is the result of that Voronoi fracture. Turning on erase n-gons will clean this up quite a bit, but even 1 degree of threshold will clean up those extra edges, and now we end up with very, very clean overall geometry. That can, of course, be pushed even further to remove some of that curvature. So now we have these very, very clean splines. Something that is pretty amazing is if we unhide that Voronoi fracture, you can see these different sections are colorized. Well, the mesh to spline is smart enough to take on those colors. So re-hiding that inside of the mesh to spline, if I move into the spline tab and say, hey, the segments aren't returning a single segment, but instead are exploded, or we can say, actually say as input, or we can actually say as input, then the colorize is automatically set to as input. And when I deselect, you'll see that each of the splines has taken on the color of whatever the display color of the incoming object was. So of course, that can be fed onto some sort of third-party renderer, and it will take on those colors. As a very quick for instance, I can add on a redshift. So redshift object tag. I would like to just render these as hair strands. Turn on redshift. And one very important thing, inside of the spline tab, I want to make sure that the redshift tag is getting copied to the individual segments inside of it. And then turning on redshift render view, hit go. And with any luck, those will pop right in, and those are now ready to go, rendering incredibly quickly there inside of our render view. So that should work pretty much in any third-party renderer. That could, of course, be fed into the material as some sort of user data. We don't need to worry about that for now. I would like to continue playing around with the Voronoi fracture. Delete the redshift tag, and let's turn this into some sort of geometry. How about feeding the mesh to spline into a volume builder and that into a volume mesher? And that's going to create a big old blob for us. Inside of the volume builder, we can set the parameters of the mesh to spline to anything we like. In this case, how about dropping the voxel size down to something small like 2, the radius to maybe 3, and the density to perhaps 2. That's how often it's sampling along the line. So we can now see these individual segments. Selecting the fracture, we are free to separate those out further from each other. Inside of the sources, I can increase the point count. Currently, it is at 20. Let's jump that up to 99. And now there's a lot more subdivisions. And we're just getting this nice, simple, clean blob outlining every single one of those. Even more fun, we can feed in the fracture itself into the volume builder. So those will now combine, and you can see that those add on top of each other. The sharper that we make our volume builder, so let's drop that to 1, we'll make these sharper as well. So maybe the radius of the spline can be lowered to 2. We start getting these very sharp connections. Going back to the fracture, how about not separating these out as much? So offset fragments, put that to 0. And now it's just the original text, but now we get these cool kind of like construction lines, almost like that construction equipment where you see all the cross bracing on the surfaces. And of course, when it comes to the volume builder, you can do things like subtract or add them together. So I want this mesher not to add to it, but instead to subtract from it, and it'll now take a bite out of it, and you even get these holes traveling through it, which is kind of fun. Yeah, I guess those would go straight through. So there are extra details there. There are so many crazy fun combinations in the commercial for Mesh to Spline. I am just cycling through endless possibilities of ways to combine this. One of my favorite ones here is, let's pull out the fracture. And even temporarily, we'll turn off everything except for checking out the fracture. And in this case, how about increasing our offset fragments and then inverting the overall shape, and then you get these bites taken out of it everywhere? I just think that's a cool look, but it looks so much better when we turn on the Mesh to Spline. Those are now getting outlined. Then when we reactivate our volume mesher, now we get these lines outlining the entire thing. If we change that volume mesher to a nice dark color, I think it looks super cool. Yeah, look how that makes those really pop, and you can still totally read it, but you get those shapes popping out from it. So totally endless combinations here. The fracture itself, we could say, hey, we want the hull only. So now it's only that outer outline, and you can see all the remaining shapes, and we are outlining every single one of those. The entire fracture could be hidden, and now we're just left with the resulting lines. And all of these combinations we are just doing with the volume fracture and mesher are not even really changing the settings inside of the Mesh to Spline itself. Inside of it, we can say, hey, how about we do some offset and let those push away from the surface, or push into the object a bit to start filling out the forms inside. Change the growth to make these lines way skinnier. Let's set that to 0 offset and 0 growth to pinch these together, and now we get almost these electrical looking lines zapping in between the different sections. And then combining that even further with that same cloner method, so we can put 2 different Mesh to Splines, tell the cloner to blend between them in linear mode, and give it a count of, I don't know, how about 5? So now the volume builder should be seeing this, and hopefully it is viewing it as a spline. So if I say growth on one is 100% and the other is at 0, it's transitioning between those two. I don't want quite as many segments, so I shall lower that down to something smaller. And now, yeah, we get this line traveling in between the two. Inside the fracture, let's have them not separate out nearly as much to spread those out. Oh, and also do not invert, please. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So now we've got these extra shapes traveling along. Inside of the cloner, we can make a couple of extra in-betweens, and you see how those begin combining. And look at this crazy shape. I wasn't even specifically going for anything in particular, and that is a pretty cool look. So unhiding the original object, we can see the, oh, this look cool colorized there. So even here, just playing around, it's like, oh, look at that look. Look at this combination. Try this. Inside of the Mesh to Spline, this one could get pushed out a bit. Let's type in 25. See those explode out and build steps as they move in. Maybe it'd be better if this one is pushed out. Set that to 25. And yeah, now the individual segments traveling out, creating more in-betweens here. Let's make there be 6, and we should see more of them stacking. Oh, look how cool that looks, like each of these stacking up on top. So yeah, limitless combinations. Everything here is parametric. We can open that up and type in C4D as the base text. That will update, and then, well, let's see, the volume mesher doesn't want updates, but if I turn it off and then turn it back on again, that has now updated, and everything just travels straight through. So keeping entirely parametric hierarchies, building these crazy combinations. And even here, that's just the beginning. You can always make another Mesh to Spline. This one could be doing, well, we've got the polygon outline, which is completely fine, but I don't want to do an offset. So this kind of just becomes an outline. Reset the offset, reset the growth. And actually this one, I don't want it to view the Voronoi fracture. I'll get rid of that. Instead, view the original text. So now that spline is seeing the original text. In spite of the original text getting consumed by the Voronoi fracture, we can interrupt it, steal it before it got fed in, and get access to that as well. So that shape could be fed into something like a sweep, and that sweep gets also fed an end side. T for scale to scale that down, and now I've got a giant outline traveling around the original text before those are getting cloned out and repeating. Hiding the original fracture, we can just see all of these crazy Mesh to Splines creating endless combinations when it comes to text. I know we already talked about converting a car into splines using Mesh to Spline, but last night, in between recording that part and this part, I went to make a demo for showing off in the live stream where I wanted to make it look a little bit like blueprints and a car. just for it in the viewport. And everything you're seeing here is pretty much Mesh to Spline. Even this background grid is a series of Mesh to Splines. I'm just using them everywhere. You can see how many different ones I put together. I have complete individual control over every single different aspect, and we're getting to see it here in the viewport really, really well. But as I was going to go eat dinner, I was like, hey, why don't I set up a render? I'll have that render while I'm gone. And the render was going so quick that I kept on increasing it from test render settings to the very final quality. So with some decently high render settings, check out how quickly this renders in Redshift. Opening this up and hitting go in the render view, we will see it pop up, and there is the car pretty much at final full quality. You see how quickly that resolves. Spin around my viewport and you can see it pop up, just rendering, pretty much ready to go. And this is just showing the power of using splines to render. And Redshift doesn't even have any kind of Sketch Toon type look. So look at how quickly I was able to put this together. Probably this entire scene from scratch took less than a half hour, working from the raw car model, making the splines, setting up the different colors. I've got some really cool techniques for being able to colorize this quickly and have very direct control. Anything here could be updated and changed. If I wanted the outline to be different, I could go and grab this overall outline and just push this out. Let's go really far so we can actually see it. We'll say 11 and instantly see that pops further out. We could have it go in, be subtle, change the way I set it up. I can actually just change the basic color and I can set that to black, and now that will render as black here. It just updates, works quickly. I was blown away. No matter how high I put the render settings, it just rendered so quickly that's like, okay, I don't have to worry about this. So I was able to sneak it into the commercial and everything just because it was so quick to put together. I am very much looking forward to seeing what types of renders and scenes and experiments people end up putting together using Mesh to Spline. One final scene file here. This is a model just created from a volume mesher on top of some generic model. So it's kind of all blobbed out. And then I bound it without any special weighting or anything, just by binding it to the mesh. And then that is now bound to one of the preset mocap animations that Cinema 4D comes with and is running along. So I went and created a couple of selections on here. You can see on the mesh that I've got this first one. And I meticulously went around and traced this to be one continuous line all around the model. Took a little while to put that together, but now that I have it, I can do anything I want with it. That selection is now called selection 1. So inside of a Mesh to Spline, I could turn that on. And as long as I drag in this selection, it will limit where Mesh to Spline is to exactly that line. Not surprising there. Let's hide that original mesh, and now we can just see that bit of spline on the character. It will perfectly stick on the top of it as it's running. I also added on the soft body dynamics tag. I love the way soft bodies work on splines. As cool as they are though, they can run a little bit slow, so I turned off self collisions, and self collisions is what would really slow this down. But I just wanted to show how fun this is just on this running character. It's just a character, it's running, being completely normal. Under the dynamics tab, I have disabled it. So as he's running, right when he jumps, I'm going to turn that on and you'll see it just fall over and flop onto the ground. It's got a little bit of initial velocity, a little initial angular velocity. So as soon as that turns on, that is activating. So turning that off, the character will just flop at that moment. Let's set that to go negative and just turn off the rotation, turn that off. And then splat, falls into the ground. A lot of fun to be had here. You definitely can't do in real time if I turn on self collisions. If I rewind all the way, let's just hit 1 frame forward, 2 frames forward. Yeah, okay, you can see it runs, but it's not exactly quick, and those will fall onto the ground. There are some specifics you have to do to make sure everything is sticking correctly onto the mesh, but you do have the ability to add a whole bunch of follow position. So we'll do 11, follow rotation, and then under soft body, I will add a lot of stiffness on there as well. And with that, once again, it's not gonna be super quick because these are all colliding with each other, but now it's attempting to stay on the body of the character because it's following its position and is a stiffness based on where that mesh is. It doesn't work perfectly and there are some steps to go through, but that's how I was able to make this animation here. So hopefully I'll have a full tutorial for that in the future. I just want to add a little tidbit for playing with soft bodies on top of these splines and their ability to be live linked on top of the model. So that wraps up this quick start video for Mesh to Spline. Hopefully there was some inspiration there for you on how to use Mesh to Spline, or maybe something cool that can be made. In any case, be sure to click on this help button to get access to, well, this video and some of the other instructional videos. And this examples button will take you to a page where there should be an ever-increasing collection of scene files to break apart, dissect, play around, reverse engineer, and just figure out some cool things you might be able to make. So that will wrap this one up. I'll see you in another video or live stream sometime. And until then, happy rendering.